Like when people don't know what Stonewall is. You know what I mean?
Why don't you tell everybody what that is?
That was fighting for gay rights, and people were killed.
Nobody was killed at Stonewall.
Nobody was killed?
Nobody was killed at Stonewall.
The Stonewall Riots, or the Stonewall Uprising, was a series of LGBT rights protests that lasted for 5 to 6 days in New York City. It was prompted by a particularly rowdy and aggressive raid of the beloved community gay bar, the Stonewall Inn. These riots, in 1969, were sensationalized and mass-covered in the media, an unprecedented amount of attention directed towards gay activism. This rebellion is considered the foundation or the beginning of the modern LGBT activism and the birthplace of the gay pride tradition. I set out to examine the socio-political context that informed and prompted the Stonewall riots. This video will analyze the information, the primary sources from the 1969 riots, and scholarly research concerning the movement's impact on LGBT activism as society knows it. I wish to clear any information commonly spread about the riots, such as people dying in vicious riots and the idea that Stonewall was the first ever LGBT activist demonstration, and emphasize who were the key victims and participants in these civil protests. The Stonewall Inn was deemed the pinnacle of gay society in New York, located in the Greenwich Village of New York City. The Stonewall Bar was seen as a safe space for the gay community, and underrepresented members of that community, such as people of color or trans folk, could show their identity and bond with the community. The bar was one of the only openly gay bars and was widely considered safe by its patrons from the regular police raids. New York law back then stated that a person must wear 3 items of clothing appropriate to their gender, and citizens would get arrested for wearing gender-inappropriate clothing or cross-dressing. The Stonewall Inn and several gay bars in the state were owned by the mafia crime families because of their sly ability to pay off the police and their ways to wiggle around the law. Bouncers would often be tipped off in the morning about an incoming raid, which happened about once a month, and the mob bosses could prevent the shutdown of the bar for the night, which were the money-making hours. Even if a raid occurred, no violent arrests were made, resulting in a mere shutdown of the business for the night. However, not even the Genovese crime family who owned the Stonewall Inn could prevent the night on June 28, 1969. The re-election of the mayor in 1969 prompted harsher crackdowns and arrests on gay individuals and bars. That special night, there were no rumors of a tip-off, and the NYPD Vice Squad Public Morals Division were particularly interested in targeting the Stonewall Bar for openly queer displays, having no official liquor license, and connections to the mafia. At 1:20 a.m., Deputy Seymour Pine and his squad of only 8 burst into the venue and announced police were taking the place.
Originally, my responsibility was just to be a policeman out there.
The undercover cops who were already lurking inside the bar joined forces with the incoming officers to make arrests on transvestites, which is an outdated term for cross-dressing, and drag queens. The police demanded the patrons to show their ID to identify gender. They forcefully led individuals out into the streets and sidewalks, where a crowd had already formed, hearing about the commotion caused inside. The discriminatory arrests and physical aggressiveness handling by the police caused the crowd, patrons, and those in handcuffs to get rowdy. Hands were swinging and fighting, random items like handbags and bottles were being used as weapons, police wagons almost teetering over, and the cops attempting to hose down the crowd. Inside the establishment, the cops were brutally beating the queer patrons and performers. A group of gay men tore a parking meter out of the ground as a battering ram to barricade the doors of the inn, trapping the cops inside. And then, a brick from a nearby construction site was thrown, making history as the act that ignited the Stonewall Uprising.
Anyway, next thing I know, I'm being flung through the air! I crash through a plate glass window and land on the floor of the Stonewall Inn!
Police were stuck, barricaded inside in the inn against the forceful crowd. When backup arrived from the Tactical Patrol Force, the crowd did not cower. Only at 3:30 a.m., hours later, 13 people were arrested, 4 officers injured, severe property damage done to the bar, but luckily no one had died, and the first night had ended. The days after unfolded like no other LGBT demonstration conducted in the past. Words of the riot passed through the community, and they showed up on the streets with jubilation and a renewed sense of social justice power to defend their rights. They would sing, kiss, dance, taunt the officers, and repeat the events of the initial night by throwing Molotov cocktails and causing havoc. Local and national newspapers covered the demonstration, shedding light on the LGBT activist community and spreading the word of their cause nationwide. Albeit much negative rhetoric and homophobia were rampant in the press reports, the community was nevertheless excited about finally receiving media coverage. The crowds continued to grow larger through the following nights and consisted of a more diverse group of LGBT community, not just the street queens or bar hoppers. The Stonewall riots initiated a flurry of organizing that soon turned into a firestorm of activism across the country. After the 5 nights, the crowd simmered down. However, on 1-year anniversary of the riots, up to 10,000 queer men and women marched in celebration and remembrance of what the Stonewall riots achieved, thus creating the first of the Pride parades. There were 2 main themes that came up in my research and analysis of the riots. The first being Stonewall as not the first protest, but the precedents for the first active resistance and the modern LGBT rights movement. It is important to note that the Stonewall riots were not the first protests. 2 years before, the 1967 march at the Black Cat Tavern was recognized as the first documented LGBT civil rights protests. In the February of 1967, hundreds of LGBT customers of the Queer Bar in Los Angeles protested outside of the bar in response to police brutality shown at their prior New Year's party. According to the One archives at the USC libraries, 14 people were arrested charged with lewd conduct, and 2 of the men caught kissing would later be forced to register as sex offenders. Gay activist group Pride, Personal Rights in Defense Education, organized the public protest on February 11th outside the bar. The protesters were not chaotic or violent, and none of their picket signs even mentioned the word homosexuality. They were passive. There were other acts that preceded Stonewall that are important to note here as well, like the 1960s homophile movement, and the Cooper's Donut protests, where the patrons of the donut shop/queer space stood up to the unfair police arrests of transgender people. In a study by Varga et al., it says that although LGBT people across the country resisted discrimination prior to Stonewall, there was limited momentum for change. Gay and lesbian organizations such as the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis had been staging demonstrations in Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia for years. But here is the main difference that I emphasize between the past demonstrations and Stonewall, of why Stonewall is heavily remembered and regarded as the initiation of the modern gay rights movement. The Stonewall Uprising was a civil disobedience that was active and aggressive, that acted as the catalyst for the following LGBT activist movements, such as the AIDS ACT UP protest we discussed in class. It was unapologetic and loud. The rioters were fearless and incensed. The LGBT community finally felt for the first time as if they had won against the police by switching their societal roles. They were the ones in charge and making the police cower. A study performed by Armstrong and Crage stated that the resonance of the Stonewall story, the appeal of the parade as commemorative form, and the fit between the Stonewall story and the parade contributed to the commemorative success. Timing mattered. Those who once felt oppressed had a spark of social activism ignited within them to actively fight against their legal and political persecution. This continuance of energy to publicly act out was unprecedented and undoubtedly the work of the Stonewall riots. Without Stonewall, we have no AIDS activism, says scholar Halkitis. He says Stonewall riots were a boisterous display by the LGBTQ population that we would no longer hide, that we would not be arrested. This rebellion and the sentiment behind it sparked the community to fight prejudice and injustice by disruptive protests in the public streets. Stonewall inspired LGBT people to not stay silent anymore while enduring oppression, but to push back and demand their rights, says Rosenbaum. Groups like the Gay Liberation Front, GAF, formed, while other pre-existing groups like the Mattachine Society became inspired by this method of activism solidified in Stonewall. A new protest behavior emerged recreating Stonewall's tactics called zaps, purposely dramatic and theatrical disruptive actions to gain spectators and media attention. The Gay Activist Alliance was formed, which engaged in militant confrontation politics, publicly exposing and aggressively challenging the homophobic rhetoric. The Stonewall riots were the instigator to gay liberation movement by proudly showing off their pride for their identity and community in an active form. Without the events that occurred in the uprising, the modern-day LGBT movement's culture and pride parades would look drastically different, perhaps a much more passive and meek about being openly gay and standing up for gay rights. The current education and historical overview of the Stonewall Uprising does not give due credit to the key activists in the movement. After the police raided the bar that night, transgender individuals such as Sylvia Rivera and Martha P. Johnson were among the first to fight back, marking a milestone in the gay rights movement. The underrepresented portion of the LGBT community, transgender people, drag queens, and street queens of color composed the main population of the first few nights of the Stonewall riots. In the 2015 film on Stonewall, which I showed earlier in the presentation, they credit a homosexual young white man as the one who threw the infamous brick. In eyewitness accounts from that first night, however, rioters state that a butch lesbian, a queer individual wearing more manly clothes, was the brick thrower and instigator of Stonewall. Many believe this individual to be Stormy De La Verie, a mixed-race drag king, an avid believer in standing up for her rights. Sylvia Rivera, a Hispanic trans woman and drag queen, was integral to the happenings of the night of June 28, 1969. She had been in the Stonewall Inn bar that night and had been lined up by the police to check her ID. She witnessed the mistreatment of her peers and joined in on the rioting, shouting "gay power" and throwing coins. When her fellow friend urged her to leave the increasingly dangerous crowd, she exclaimed, "Are you nuts? I'm not missing a minute of this. It's the revolution." She continued to return in the following days of the protest to incite and defy the police. In the pride parades and activist demonstrations in the year post-Stonewall, she was heavily involved with active civil disobedience protests.
And the nickels, the dimes, the pennies, and the quarters started flying.
Why? Why that? Why do people do that?
The payoff. That was the payoff. That was the payoff.
It was to symbolize the payoff.
Yep. You already got...
Here's some more.
And here's some more.
Her friend, a black trans woman and self-identified drag queen Marsha P. Johnson, has only recently received recognition for her influence in the Stonewall Uprising as well. Her participation in the first night is heavily debated, whether she was present or even the individual who threw the brick. However, it is confirmed that on the second night of the raids and riots, Marsha P. Johnson climbed on top of a light pole to drop a heavy purse on a police car to shatter its glass windows. She later marched in the first gay pride rally a year later and became a key member of the Gay Liberation Front.
I was having a party uptown, and we were all out there, and Miss Sylvia and Rivera and them were over in the park having a cocktail. I was uptown, and I didn't get downtown until about 2 o'clock, because when I got downtown, the place was already on fire, and it was a raid already. The riots had already started, and they said the police went in there and set the place on fire. They said the police set it on fire because they originally wanted the Stonewall to close, so they had several raids.
It is crucial that we acknowledge these diverse voices that contributed to the Stonewall Uprising and the LGBT modern movement of activism. These individuals served as the instigator or the catalyst for the movement, showcasing their resilience to fight against oppression in an active way. We must understand and clear these misconceptions of Stonewall history and properly remember and credit the individuals who contributed to this movement that made following gay movements and demonstrations possible.